Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be here today representing ACS, a long-time supporter of the Council. My name is Vicente Maraña, and I serve as ACS Infrastructure's Chief Operating Officer. ACS believes in building a better future through the development of infrastructure that helps the economic and social progress of the countries where we are present. We are proud of our track record in delivering more than 150 concession-type projects internationally, including the successful delivery of many P3s across Canada since 2007. Amongst others, Montreal's A30 project, the Northeast Anthony Henday project in Edmonton, the Right Honourable Herb Gray Parkway in Windsor, and the new Champlain Bridge also in Montreal. Right now, we are partnering with several of you in the room on critical infrastructure such as the Gordie Howe International Bridge, Eglinton LRT, and Finch West LRT here in Toronto. It is a great honor to introduce Peter Fragiskatos, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. He is stepping in for Minister Sean Fraser, who couldn't be here with us today. Peter was first elected as the Member of Parliament for London North Centre in 2015. He was appointed to his current role as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities in September. Prior to entering federal politics, he served as an academic at Western University and a media commentator. His works have been published by major Canadian and international news organizations, including Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, BBC News, and CNN. Peter holds a political science degree from Western University, a master's degree in international relations from Queen's University, and a PhD in international relations from Cambridge University. We at ACS are looking forward to hearing the federal government's vision on how it can best support and guide Canada's growth through infrastructure, as well as how the government and the private sector can work together to make this vision a reality for all Canadians. With that, I am pleased to welcome onto the stage Parliamentary Secretary Peter Fragiskatos. Joining him for a Fireside Chat is Lisa Mitchell, the Council's President and CEO. Thank you.
Kind introduction. I wasn't expecting that. Thank you. Gracias, Vicente, for the, I just said to him, I wasn't expecting such a kind introduction. It was unnecessary, but very much appreciated. It is an honor to be here, and really 30 years you've been doing this. This is quite something. And I know Minister Fraser sends his regards. He was not able to be here today, but it is a pleasure to be in his place. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici pour une occasion très importante pour votre secteur, a sector that has contributed so much to the Canadian economy and to the Canadian society. My political science background was mentioned. I can't help but think, when I think about infrastructure, about the role of the state and what the state is all about and what government's all about, and that is to ensure fundamentally the well-being of people, to ensure their basic needs, to ensure their security. But I think infrastructure fits into that in very real ways. If we think about what people need, what they value, how they thrive, you can't help but focus on infrastructure. It is central to building communities and making them successful. And within that, the public-private model is one that is tremendous as an example, providing a framework for going forward and an example for the rest of the world. The work that you've done here has contributed a great deal, not just for our own economy, but for other economies as well. I think about, for example, transportation. The Gordie Howe Bridge which is now, I mean, if you look at it, the jobs that come out of that, trade and investment at such a fundamental point in this country's history, the way forward, whether we build a successful economy going forward, that is crucial to questions that people are asking and will continue to ask. And having this vital corridor is fundamental to all of this. Of course, the tourism and the economic growth that will be generated from that is something that needs to be emphasized as well. Across the country and across the world, people are rightly asking questions about climate change. This is the central challenge of our time. I think of projects like the N-Wave District Energy Project, with $600 million in support from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. That fundamental model is now helping communities in Toronto, in London, my own hometown, Charlottetown, Windsor, and Markham, providing a reliable source of heating and cooling while also seeing a very significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Also, public transit. You can't talk about thriving communities without talking about the fundamentals of transit. The priority for this government on the infrastructure side has hinged on many different things, and we'll be talking about that with Lisa shortly. But public transit has been front and center. So many different transit projects have been funded by this government across the country. Again, I point to the Infrastructure Bank's work on this. In York Region, not very far from here, by 2027, there will be 180 zero-emission buses. The electrification of that fleet is something that has been identified as a key priority by that municipality, and the Infrastructure Bank is helping in that. Now, let me just mention something about the Infrastructure Bank. The over 40 projects now that the bank is involved in, directing well over $20 billion, $28 billion towards those projects, is something that I think stands as a model. There's other examples throughout. I mean, the UK is pursuing this. Ontario, in fact, the provincial government just recently, you would have seen, has announced its intention to go down this road. The United States, albeit in a different way, has a different model where government is more directly involved, but still there is an infrastructure bank model that is pursued there. This is something that can really transform, and I understand that you would see that, but I just wanted to commend you on the work that's been happening through this conference and through your collaborations over the past, since 1993, because I think there's a case to be made that were it not for those collaborations, it's hard to see how the Infrastructure Bank would have come to be. Perhaps it would have, but I think all of you have helped to plant a very important seed in that direction, if I can put it that way. Finally, housing. The tie between housing and infrastructure has always been obvious, but not emphasized by governments of the past. One of the fundamental objectives of Minister Fraser has been to ensure that there's much more of a tie that's not just emphasized, but in our infrastructure vision is really brought to the fore. Before I touch on that, and it'll be the Accelerator Fund that really illustrates this, the National Housing Strategy overall, introduced by the government in 2017, albeit in a different context, has produced results. This is a program with a very fundamental social focus. We do have an immense challenge, if not crisis, of homelessness throughout the country. And where the National Housing Strategy has fit in is to work with municipalities, with provincial governments, and with not-for-profit partners to overcome that in whatever way possible. There are results. 69,000 people have been lifted off the street as a result of the strategy. They are now housed. They are now able to access the vital wraparound supports that allow them to make a transition to something much more positive. 122,000 people who were near being homeless are now housed as a result of the strategy as well. Again, in partnership has been, and I think you can appreciate this just because of by virtue of the fact that the P3 model emphasizes cooperation, emphasizes collaboration. This is all made possible by collaborating with with governments of all orders, with the not-for-profit sector, but also the private sector. The low-interest loans that have been so often secured by builders to put together housing is something that's crucial as well and part of the strategy. I mentioned the Housing Accelerator Fund. This is a $4 billion fund that sees our government working with municipalities that want to embrace housing. Let me move away from homelessness now for a moment and just talk about the supply challenge that has created unaffordable rent and homes that are too difficult to purchase, especially for first-time buyers. The supply challenge has led to this, and the way out is building. And we need the private sector there, because missing middle housing, if I can put it this way, has to be legalized. The minister has spoken about that at length, and he will continue to. We need to see more duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, mid-rise apartments, row houses, all of these things. And when municipalities make clear that they want to build, there's federal money on the table. And part of this, of course, includes the enabling infrastructure that's so fundamental to housing, but also the community infrastructure that allows for communities to be what they should. I also emphasize another point here, which is incenting the private sector to do what you need to do. The estimates on the number of homes that we need in the coming years, I mean, it's an enormous number, depending on, there's different estimates out there, but we're going to need millions of more homes. That's for certain. I go with the CMHC estimate on this, which is well over 3 million homes in the coming years, in addition to what is already planned. We need the private sector there, because the cost of that for government to take on its own, there's different estimates, but it's over $1 trillion at least. And that's why Minister Fraser introduced very recently, just a few weeks back, the waiver of the GST to allow builders in a context of high interest rates and other challenges to have the opportunity to, well, it's an incentive, and that's how we get things done. The Housing Accelerator Fund is part of this. The GST waiver is part of it. The National Housing Strategy will continue to be very, very important, but also an industrialized approach to housing, making sure that we think about models that haven't been pursued before, like modular housing, for example. Modular housing is something that I think has a great deal of potential. We are doing it in Canada, but not to the level that we could. And there's, I think, more to look forward to in terms of incentives that could be provided to the private sector to get involved in that space. I know that there's other countries that have pursued this with a great deal of success. Japan, for example, Scandinavian countries, all of you know this very well because you're in this space as it is. But this is something that you can look forward to the government pursuing in the weeks and months to come. With that said, I look forward to the Fireside Chat, and thank you very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you so much for stepping in for the minister this morning. As we mentioned, for those in the room, should you have any questions, the Parliamentary Secretary has kindly offered to answer any audience questions as well too. So I think there's a QR code that you can scan and use that function to answer questions or to ask your questions. I'm going to jump right in if that's okay. I mean, this government came in with a very strong infrastructure agenda back in 2015 and has made historic advancements since 2015, 2016. But a lot of that funding's now been allocated. It's been put to very good use, and it's had a huge impact on communities across Canada. But we've also heard the government speak about sort of the next generation of federal infrastructure programs and initiatives. So I guess it prompts the question for those of us in the room that helped build that. What will the next generation of public infrastructure programming look like? And what types of delivery models will you be exploring?
I think you can continue to look to government to do what it's done over the past few years. Water in the most general form, and the pipes that have been installed and built throughout the country, thousands of kilometers, for example. Wastewater infrastructure, working with municipalities to ensure that they have the fundamentals, the tools they need to put that in place. Public transit. I mentioned transit as an example. I gave the example of York Region, but there's always going to be a need for this. And a permanent fund is something that the government has committed to. But also climate adaptation. We've pursued that agenda, and we will continue to. There's not a summer that has gone by in recent memory that doesn't include some kind of natural disaster, unfortunately. And we have to realize, while taking, on the one hand, very serious action to realize our obligations on the global warming side of things, pricing carbon, for example, other measures, we have an obligation to mitigate the effects of climate change as much as possible. And that means working with municipalities. That means working with provincial governments. But the private sector can be there too. They have the expertise, they have the knowledge on how to get things built. Yeah, so.
Well, we look forward to seeing what comes out in the future.
Let me just also add on the housing side, because this is really now the fundamental priority. I said climate change is the challenge of our time, but we have an immediate challenge, and that is housing, and that is going to be with us for the next few years for sure. So tying housing to infrastructure, making sure there's a clear line between all of those, I think is something that you're going to continue to see the government emphasize, and we will continue to work with the private sector to bring their knowledge and their abilities to the fore to get those results.
In 2021, the government released the Building Pathways to 2050 moving forward on the National Infrastructure Assessment. I think there's many people in this room that see the real value and benefit of a national infrastructure assessment. And in fact, the council has advocated as it being a useful tool for Canada to improve coordination between infrastructure owners and funders and determine the best way to finance infrastructure. Are you able to provide us a bit of an update on the status of the National Infrastructure Assessment?
I think you can see there will certainly be something by the end of this year, and I'm speaking specifically now of an advisory council that it really reflects a great deal of consultation that was done throughout the country with industry experts, understanding what model would best serve the country. And we need a council of experts to advise on the way forward. Net zero is fundamental to every conversation that we are having, including on the infrastructure side, obviously. But an advisory council or board will be crucial, because they would bring the expertise, the background, the necessary. They would have the necessary talents and abilities to give government insight on what exactly we can do. And we've seen it where it's worked in other places. Let me just deviate here from an environmental focus, but the model of collaboration, the P3 example, just in infrastructure, generally speaking, the transportation, to get into one specific example, the Regina Bypass project. The government committed just a few years ago in 2019, $200 million to make that a reality, but it involved collaboration at all levels, including with the private sector, to build new roads, to build access roads, to really revitalize an infrastructure system and a transportation system that needed a great deal of work. And it's a proven model now. We can look to that as something that can really serve as an example for other communities too. I just point to that as one example. One can think of others too.
Yeah, great. You and Minister Fraser have talked a lot about housing, and they've combined the portfolios at the federal level, infrastructure, communities, and housing. And we know that there's a lot of infrastructure, enabling infrastructure that supports those housing developments. Very clear in your opening remarks that the housing crisis is top priority for your government. And you have a room full of leaders from Canada's infrastructure industry, developers, advisors, lawyers, construction firms, legal firms, financiers, you name it. they're represented here in the room. What role do you think they can play to help address the issues in the country, and how? How can we help?
I think we're going to continue to need your advice. This is not something that government will solve on its own, nor should it. The way forward necessitates that we work as closely as we possibly can with the private sector. I talked about waiving the GST, for example, on purpose-built rentals. This is something that was called for a long time, and the government did act. The idea being that if you incent the private sector, you can actually get the results that you're looking for. We're seeing that, we will see that going forward with purpose-built rentals. We will see it with respect to the work that's done with municipalities. We need more homes. There's no other way to put it. We have to build as much as we possibly can. The way forward where government, I think, can help the private sector is twofold. An industrial strategy, as I use that phrase in my remarks, it's the one the minister has used time and again. It is really about putting together those things that the private sector will need to thrive in this regard. You will need workers. And so our immigration strategy is now much more tailored towards facilitating the arrival of those with the skills and abilities to help build. We have to emphasize the trades more in Canada. We have young people that want to pursue the trades. We have to see more of that in our education curriculum. I leave that rather to provincial governments to sort out, and I know they're working on it. He's not in politics now, he's recently left, but Monty McNaughton, the former Minister for Infrastructure in Ontario, I think did tremendous work in helping to really propel forward training programs for young people, lifting up the trades, dealing with the stigma, unfortunately, that exists around trades. I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s where if one said that they wanted to go into the trades, there was an unfortunate perception there. There wasn't, the emphasis was always on being a doctor or a lawyer or engineer. Lots of engineers in the room, it's a great thing. But there's honor in being a plumber, in being a builder, in being an electrician. One could give other examples, but that's what I think you're going to continue to see the government do. Really work with provincial governments to make sure that the trades are emphasized, but also building that into our immigration strategy too. I mentioned modular housing as an area of focus. We need homes built, and we need them built fast, and modular allows for that. But we need a focus that allows the sector to grow. Mm-hmm. Incentivizing the growth of that sector will be crucial to the way forward. We're not a leader in this realm, but we could be. And I think you can look forward to the government putting in place the fundamental policy building blocks to get that sector off the ground in ways that we haven't seen before.
We do have a couple of questions from the audience. You've talked about transit, and public transit's been a priority of the government very clearly for the past little while. So one question on what the strategy of the government will be around transit-oriented development, affordable housing and around being a catalyst for projects such as high-frequency rail.
I think if you...
question.
Yeah, no, it is a very good question. And if you look at the way we've done transit before, the way that we've funded it is, there's examples going back years now where we've tied transit to housing and specifically affordable housing. But that's even more emphasized now through the Housing Accelerator Fund. Municipalities will have to, and there's federal dollars on the table potentially, but municipalities will have to present plans and make clear that they want to see more built in the way of affordable housing and housing just in general. So a market and non-market focus. But situating that housing near key transit corridors. Now, this is, the question is on high-frequency rail projects as well. Building homes near all kinds of transit, I think, is going to be a huge priority, and I think that municipalities across the country are looking more towards that and incenting that decision is something that the federal government can do just by the power of its, the purse strings, they don't lie, right? It's a very real thing. We've seen communities step up throughout the country. My own in London, $74 million invested so that we could see more homes built. An extra 2,000 homes will be built in the coming years. Kelowna's signed on. St. John, Halifax, has signed on. Don't want to mix those up. There's various examples of how this is working. Vaughan would be another example. And we have over 540 applications right now from municipalities across the country, big and small, that want to see more homes built. And particularly in cities, the focus is on an approach that it's transit-oriented development, but also where there's a focus, a desire to build around, with high-frequency rail. That's something that's really key to this too. I know that we have, just in terms of the high-frequency rail approach, take it away from housing just for a moment. There is phase one and phase two of ensuring higher speed and higher frequency rail. That's ongoing, and I think that's going to be transformative for Ontario into Quebec, but for the country as a whole.
I made a comment in my opening remarks, and we talk a lot about it with this group. But there's a question here for you in terms of how we can bring the last P, the partnership P, back on the table. I'd be curious to get your thoughts. And I'd say that you're sitting in front of a large group of people that I'm not sure anybody has the full answer yet now. So we'd just be looking for your views on that.
Well, I think partnership is fundamental to, as I've said throughout here today, you can't get things done unless you have various orders of government at the table, but also the not-for-profit sector. I think about not-for-profits with respect to housing in particular, but also the private sector. Infrastructure and housing are now joined at the hip much more than ever before, certainly from a federal perspective. Unless we're regularly engaging with the private sector, unless we're incentivizing the private sector as much as possible, then we won't get to the results that we're looking for. Yeah. Well, what are some of the things, maybe we can spark a discussion around this, what are some of the ideas that you hear in your circles about how we can bring this to life greater? By way of advice, or
Well, I think one of the things we talk about is getting everyone around the table and being open and honest and having frank discussions about the market shifting. Projects are getting bigger, larger, more complex, and so as that shifts, how do we collectively understand and work together? And I think you'll hear a lot of those threads through the discussions as we go forward for the next 2 days. I'd like to think that we have all the answers, but we're still working on it collectively. And I think our next panel actually is going to tackle some of that as well too.
And the infrastructure bank, which I've talked about, but this is something that has, there's many projects that are ongoing now, over 40. It's a relatively new approach, and yes, it's pursued in other countries, but the potential for this in the future is very real. So how can we use that to get the really key infrastructure? Yes, infrastructure in all its forms matters, but the really key infrastructure that is for the government to pay on its own is prohibitive. Mm-hmm. How can we bring in the private sector? How can we crowd in, if you want to use that term, that funding, so that we get the results that we all want to create stronger communities and a stronger country? I think this is something that you can continue to see the government look towards. It's a model that's working, but it has much more potential as well.
Great. Well, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think this is a really important conversation as a significant funder of infrastructure. How the federal government is viewing the landscape, I think, is really key for us to understand and learn about. So thank you very much for...
I appreciated the time. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.